Thank you for stopping by and welcome to the 311 Griffin YouTube channel. In this video, I'll be discussing the legacy of aerospace and flight. Humans have legacies involving anything, cars, tools, woodworking, welding, writing, collecting stamps or art, any hobby or occupation that a person can think of can have a legacy attached to it and passed down. The legacy of aerospace, flight, helicopters, airplanes, and flight simulators is like any other legacy, but I wanted to share my story and my legacy. And I began to think about this as we approached the release of the DCS F-16C Viper. The F-16 Fighting Falcon has always been my favorite aircraft, and it is actually the very first plane I ever fell in love with. Therefore, I think it's just natural for me to contemplate when I started my love for flight and why I started to love flight and aerospace with the release of this module. While I discuss the subject, you'll obviously be seeing some random scenes from DCS, primarily the F-16 module. So my story is like many other people's stories, and that's kind of what interests me most and what ties this conversation back to DCS and other flight simulators. So many people in the flight simulator community and the DCS community share similar stories to this one, but we're from all different parts of the world. And that's what's really beautiful about legacies and about this legacy in particular for me. I've had the privilege of talking to real world pilots, not just from the United States military, but from all over the world. And here recently I've had a few opportunities to talk to DCS pilots from England, all of which have served in the British armed forces, and several have been actual RAF pilots from England. And I've been able to make textures or skins for their airplanes to kind of help them personalize their planes that they fly all the time in DCS and get some more immersion into the flight simulator. And it's just it's an honor for me to be able to do that for people, and to kind of give back to the community with my knowledge and with my abilities in making textures and skins, which I'm not the greatest at, but it's just really kind of cool to connect with people around the world. And the legacy of aerospace is what makes that possible, because someone loved flight enough to make simulation software, and other people loved it enough that they would spend tons and tons of money on flight controls and computer screens and computers to drive the animation and the software itself. And then a person like me can kind of creep around the community and make friends, receive help from people, and then give help to other people while gathering a large amount of knowledge about the real world aircraft and the simulator so I can pass that on. So early in my life, I really loved dinosaurs, and my parents got me all kinds of dinosaur books. They weren't really into airplanes, so I'm thinking around the age of 5, I think I started to develop a love for aircraft, and my parents didn't really know what to do about that. I'm not sure why I started, but my uncle was in the Air Force, and he actually had his own Cessna 172, and we went up for a ride in it, and I barely remember that. My grandfather, also my dad's dad and this particular uncle's father, he worked on airplanes, and he was a really good machinist, but he was a farmer as well. And what he would do is he would farm, and then when he needed money or just felt like going out and working, or he had some time between harvest and planting or whatever, he would go and contract for various airplane manufacturers. McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing were the three that I remember him actually going to work on. And he would come back with these little desk models or things to put on the shelf, kind of to commemorate his work on those. And I would ask him about them, and he would tell me about the engines, or it's where I first learned about the C-130 Hercules and the B-1 bomber and things like that. They lived in a house. My grandparents lived in this house that he built himself, and it was a small house out in the country. It was basically, it was one story, but it was sort of 1.5 levels. So the front of the house was one level, and then you would walk up these giant concrete steps about 6 feet up for the back of the house, and it was on a different level. And it had no heat and air, and so we would go down on in the summertime, and we would visit, and we would stay there. And at night, all the doors were open. There were screen doors and screens on the windows, and everything was open, and the fans were running, and you could hear coyotes howling, and you could hear frogs in the pond behind the house croaking, and there was this oil well that was pumping all through the night at a distance. And then in the morning, Grandpa would get up early, and he would stoke the fire, and he would smoke a cigarette, and Grandma would brew him some coffee and start cooking breakfast. So we'd always wake up to the smell of biscuits and sausage mixed with the strong smell of coffee and tobacco and the more subtle wood fire smoke. And we'd get up, and Grandpa would tell us all about farming and building things, and when I could, I'd get him talking about these airplanes. And so I really started to develop a love from my grandpa and my uncle. My uncle we didn't see much because he was in the Air Force, and he was overseas quite a bit. But as far as I can tell, this is kind of where my love for aircraft started out. Now, on the kind of the half level up, right behind the fireplace, the big fireplace was right in the middle, and there was a set of steps on each side that went up in my grandparents' house, and there was a hallway that went behind the fireplace or behind the chimney, and there was this little shelf there, and my grandpa had a bunch of periodicals there that were the illustrated encyclopedia of aircraft, I think is what they're called. I've got a picture here that I'll show, and he had all of these magazines there, and I would get them out and look at them, and I remember just poring over these every time I went down there. And this is where I first saw the picture of the F-16, and instantly I thought the F-16 was the greatest thing ever created. I argued with my cousin about which was better, a Falcon or a Tomcat. He debated that the Tomcat had more thrust and 2 engines, and I wondered if maybe a smaller plane didn't need 2 engines, and that's why it was better. And I was too young to know for sure, but I knew that the Falcon was the most beautiful thing ever. And of course later I developed a respect for the Tomcat, but my love of the F-16 just never went away. So a few years later, I was in 5th or 6th grade, and my uncle was stationed at Shepherd Air Force Base, and there was an air show going on down there. And we were able to go down on the second day, which was a free day. It was like a friends and family day. And they had an A-10 with a pilot sitting in it that you could talk to, and we climbed up and looked in that and talked to him. There was the very new F-117 Nighthawk, roped off and guarded, and my cousin tried to go across the rope and got in trouble. And my uncle got to fly in the air show in a formation of T-38 Talons, and then he came down to sit with us after he got done with everything, which was a huge treat because it was, obviously he was a pilot there at the air show, and he got to talk to us about flying in the air show, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I still remember he came down and he said a joke. He said, "I tried to roll the window down to wave, but I just couldn't get it down in time." And it was a great time. An F-15 flew in. It was the first time I'd ever seen an F-15 Eagle, and it did a solo demonstration. And then, lo and behold, I'd never even heard of these guys, but the Thunderbirds come in out of nowhere and land. And then they shut down, they did a bunch of checks, refueled, whatever, did their little routine, and then took off and did the amazing show that they do. And I couldn't believe it. It was the most amazing thing ever. So that hooked me. And later on in high school, my uncle actually died in a plane crash. He bought a stunt plane, and it had been rebuilt by some people, and the NTSB report suggested that they didn't use proper glue when they put the wings back together, and he was doing touch and goes at his local airport, and the wings actually fell off, and he died on impact. And a few years later, my grandpa died of heart failure, and I was a little bit too young. Of course, I loved aircraft, but I didn't see my uncle very much, and I never really thought to talk to him or to ask him questions about this. Not necessarily for my own knowledge, but to give them a chance to pass that stuff on. And so I look back on that, and I just kind of wish that I had more time with them to help them, pass their legacy on, because they were both heavily involved in aircraft and in aerospace, and they loved it very deeply. So after my grandfather's death, my grandmother surprised me and gave me these magazines that he had. And I don't know that he pored over them all the time, but I spent so much time with them. It was it was just kind of cool to get them, and it reminds me of both my uncle and my grandfather. And I still peruse over them every once in a while, look for information in them here and there, or just look at them for the fun of it. Just as a sidebar, if anybody happens to know where I can get my hands on other issues of those magazines, let me know, because my collection is not complete. So in college, I took a ground school class, and I took the written exam and passed it, but I just couldn't afford pilots or flight lessons. So I just never took the flight lessons, never got my pilot's license. But I always wanted a flight simulator. My brother had gotten a copy of Flight Simulator 3 when I was in like junior high or middle school, something like that. And I flew it constantly, to the point that when I was in high school, I was a senior, and I went to a Technology Students Association conference in Oklahoma City, and they had a full setup with a yoke and flap controls and a throttle and rudder pedals and all that kind of stuff, and nobody could fly this thing. But I recognized it was, the graphics were better. They were actually what I considered to be absolutely top-notch graphics, a fully faithful representation of Chicago. But I recognized Chicago Midway, and I recognized that this was the same Cessna that I had flown in FS3, even though the graphics looked better. So I waited my turn, and I sat down, and a friend of mine, like, he made some jokes, and then he saw that like I was setting my flaps and I was holding the brakes, and I throttled it up, and then I let it pick up speed, and then I took off at a reasonable speed and without yanking on the controls, and I got the plane in the air. Nobody else was able to get it in the air while I was sitting there watching. And I got it in the air, and I flew around, and I did the signature move of like flying between the antennas on what was then called the Sears Tower. And it's not that hard of a move. It just really impresses people if they've never flown a flight simulator before. And it was really cool, and I thought, I've got to get my hands on one of these, but this has got to be a lot of money, I went off to college later, and I had no money, working jobs, building my career, and it just took me so long to work up through a career. And I tried from time to time different demos of flight simulators, and I could not get them to work. They were unflyable. They were frustrating. I hated them. And of course, I was trying to fly with mouse and keyboard, and that's just really hard to do, even though you can do it. But there was just a situational awareness was completely missing, control was completely missing, and it just never was any fun at all. And then a few years ago, my friend Warthog talked to me about DCS and the 810. Sorry, Warlock. Warlock is what he goes by in DCS. He talked to me about the A10C Warthog and about DCS, and I kind of looked it up and saw a YouTube video of Matt Wagner doing a bombing tutorial, and I was definitely intrigued. The clickable cockpit sold me, and I noticed that he was looking around, and I didn't know how he was looking around, but I thought, I've got to get my hands on something like this. So I actually bought it before doing enough research, and I tried to play it with mouse and keyboard, and I hated it. Warlock loaned me one of his old joysticks, and it was better, but it was a twist stick with a throttle on, like, slider on the stick, and it wasn't good. I kept crashing, and so I spent a ton of money on Track IR and a Thrustmaster Warthog HOTAS and a SATEC Pro Combat Flight pedals or whatever, and just poured over the A10C documentation for weeks. And it probably took me a year before I could even come close to keeping up with Warlock on weapons employment, but it was time well spent, and I got a lot of enjoyment out of the A10. And later I learned how to make my own textures for it. I made some help files. I just started buying these modules. Most of these modules I don't even fly. I never fly them. But I'm just intrigued by how much I can learn from a flight simulator like DCS. And of course, DCS isn't the only flight simulator out there, but the community is, by and large, very helpful and very friendly. Every community has its guys or gals that don't really seem to get it, and they want to prove how much they know, or they want to be really rude to people. But most of the people in the DCS community I've found have been just really, really top-notch. And so now that I have it, my setup's not complete. There are some things that I'd like to add to it, but now that I have my setup to where it's pretty immersive, It's just a lot of fun to jump into, and it provides me a platform to enjoy a hobby that I've never been able to find a way to enjoy in real life. So it's safer, it's cheaper, and it's not like it's that dangerous. Flying is not that dangerous, but it's safer, it's cheaper. My wife doesn't complain too much about it. And even though my kids aren't really into flight, I know that there are other people out there that I will be able to share my knowledge with that I've picked up through DCS. And in the meantime, I just love connecting with the people online and the people that, I love helping people get their setups completed or get textures for their airplanes that they like, that they fly, and all that kind of stuff. And it's really cool that we get to do this. So for that, I'm grateful to my grandpa and my uncle who established a love of flight in me, to the multitudes of developers who've made simulations either volunteering to do mods or to put together simulators or for profit for an actual developer. And I'm thankful to the community who, for the most part, are extremely helpful and patient to new virtual pilots and old virtual pilots. So that's my story, and I really appreciate you guys listening. I know that everybody has a story of how they got into this hobby and why they're in this legacy or contributing to this legacy. So thank you for listening to mine, and I hope that it's touching for people, because I really want people to feel how thankful I am to the community, and I want people to feel how awesome it is to be a part of it. So with that, if you guys will excuse me, I need to go learn more about flying the Viper. Thanks.